Destiny never asks for permission. It arrives disguised as your greatest mistake. The Grand Moon Banquet at Blackthorn Palace had welcomed kings, queens, nobles, ambassadors, and alpha leaders from every corner of the kingdom, transforming the ancient fortress into a sea of crystal chandeliers, polished marble, and shimmering silver banners that reflected the glow of the full moon beyond towering stained glass windows. Musicians filled the enormous ballroom with elegant orchestral melodies while servants glided silently between hundreds of distinguished guests carrying polished silver trays filled with sparkling glasses and carefully prepared dishes. Every conversation carried the confidence of privilege. Every smile concealed generations of influence, and every graceful movement reminded those without titles exactly where they belonged. Emily Carter understood that better than anyone. At 23 years old, she had spent nearly her entire adult life serving people who rarely noticed she existed. Her neatly braided brown hair was tucked carefully beneath the modest style expected of palace attendants, and her simple servant's uniform blended almost perfectly with the countless others moving quietly throughout the magnificent hall. Her blue eyes remained focused on every assignment, every delicate glass, every careful step across the marble floor. She had learned long ago that remaining invisible was often the safest place for someone like her. As an Omega without family, wealth, or influence, she had become accustomed to whispered assumptions before anyone ever learned her name. Yet despite every quiet dismissal, Emily never allowed bitterness to settle inside her heart. She greeted elderly servants with genuine kindness, helped younger workers who struggled beneath heavy trays, and smiled with quiet warmth even when no one bothered returning the gesture. Tonight, however, everything felt different. The atmosphere inside the ballroom carried an unusual anticipation that reached beyond politics or celebration. The arrival of Alpha King Adrian Blackwood had drawn every eye toward the towering entrance. Conversations faded almost instantly as the massive, carved doors opened to reveal the kingdom's ruler walking with calm confidence beneath the golden light of hundreds of candles. At 30 years old, Adrian possessed the quiet authority of someone who never needed to demand attention because it followed him naturally. His black ceremonial coat fit perfectly across broad shoulders, the embroidered silver wolf crest catching the candlelight with every measured step. His composed silver eyes studied the room without arrogance, acknowledging foreign rulers, respected elders, and longtime advisors with subtle nods instead of theatrical displays. Even surrounded by unimaginable wealth, his presence alone became the most commanding sight inside the palace. Emily lowered her gaze respectfully as he passed nearby, carefully balancing a crystal decanter upon a polished silver tray. She expected nothing more than another ordinary evening filled with careful routines and silent responsibilities. She certainly never imagined that within minutes, every carefully constructed certainty surrounding her life would begin to unravel. Across the ballroom, Lady Victoria Ashcroft observed the young servant with quiet calculation. Draped in an elegant midnight blue gown adorned with silver embroidery, Victoria smiled politely while speaking with influential nobles, yet her attention repeatedly returned to Emily. Few people noticed the subtle movements hidden behind graceful etiquette. Even fewer recognized how effortlessly Victoria guided conversations, redirected servants, and positioned herself exactly where opportunity favored her ambitions. She understood the fragile balance of reputation inside the royal court better than almost anyone. Sometimes a single embarrassing moment accomplished more than years of careful planning. Emily continued serving guests one table at a time, unaware that invisible threads had already begun tightening around her. The music swelled as dancers entered the center of the ballroom. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath moonlight filtering through stained glass. Palace guards maintained perfect formation beside towering marble columns, while respected priests exchanged quiet observations near the royal platform. Everything appeared flawless, balanced, predictable. Then Victoria shifted only one graceful step. It looked almost accidental. Almost. Emily turned with the silver tray at precisely the same moment another servant crossed behind her. A gentle collision disrupted her balance for only a heartbeat, but in a room where every eye instinctively followed the Alpha King, A single heartbeat was enough to change history forever. The crystal decanter slipped from Emily Carter's trembling hands just enough for a wave of crimson wine to arc gracefully through the air before splashing across the front of Alpha King Adrian Blackwood's black ceremonial coat. Time itself seemed to hesitate. The orchestra stopped in the middle of a single note. Hundreds of conversations vanished into complete silence. Even the flickering candlelight appeared frozen as every guest stared toward the impossible scene unfolding at the center of the grand moon banquet. Emily's heart dropped with the empty silver tray still balanced in her hands. She could barely breathe as the deep red stain spread across the beautifully embroidered silver wolf crest resting over the king's chest. She immediately lowered her eyes, every lesson she had learned as a servant telling her that this single mistake would define the rest of her life. She carefully placed the tray on a nearby table before stepping forward with shaking hands. "Your Majesty, I am deeply sorry," she whispered, her voice almost disappearing inside the overwhelming silence. It was an accident. No one answered her. Instead, whispers slowly began flowing through the crowd like cold wind moving across still water. Several nobles exchanged knowing glances while others quietly shook their heads. One elderly ambassador sighed heavily, already expecting punishment. A younger noblewoman covered her mouth in disbelief. Palace servants standing near the walls turned pale, understanding better than anyone how unforgiving royal protocol could become during formal ceremonies. Across the ballroom, Lady Victoria Ashcroft maintained a perfectly composed expression, though satisfaction briefly flickered behind her elegant smile before disappearing. Beneath flawless etiquette, she gracefully approached the gathering crowd without appearing hurried, as though she had simply happened to witness an unfortunate accident. "What a tragic misunderstanding," she said softly, allowing sympathy to color every carefully chosen word. The king's ceremonial coat was prepared specifically for tonight's sacred gathering. Such an unfortunate mistake will surely require appropriate consideration. Her tone remained polite, but every listener understood the hidden message beneath her graceful language. Emily felt dozens of eyes settle upon her with quiet judgment. She wanted to explain that another servant had crossed behind her. She wanted to say she had felt someone unexpectedly shift beside her. She wanted to tell the truth exactly as it had happened. Yet every explanation suddenly sounded like an excuse inside her own thoughts. She remained standing with lowered eyes, accepting responsibility, because arguing before the royal court would only deepen the humiliation. Several palace guards instinctively stepped forward, waiting only for the king's command. The high priestess watched silently from the royal platform, her thoughtful expression revealing neither approval nor concern. The royal historian slowly closed the ancient ceremonial record he had been carrying, sensing that this evening had unexpectedly become part of history itself. Adrian Blackwood had not spoken a single word. The wine continued soaking into the dark fabric of his coat, yet his attention seemed strangely detached from the stain itself. Instead, his silver eyes rested quietly upon Emily. There was no visible anger, no disappointment, no sign of wounded pride. His calm expression remained almost unreadable, making the silence even more unsettling than outrage would have been. Emily slowly lifted her eyes for only a brief moment before immediately lowering them again. During that single heartbeat, their gazes met. Something unexpected passed across Adrian's face, not recognition exactly, but a quiet uncertainty that caught even him by surprise. It felt as though some distant memory had brushed against the edge of his mind before disappearing again. Around them, the silence became almost unbearable. Every noble waited for judgment. Every servant feared what would happen next. Victoria patiently watched the king, confident that protocol would soon restore order. Yet Adrian did nothing anyone expected. He neither called for punishment nor demanded apologies from those surrounding him. Instead, he took one slow step closer to Emily, studying her face with calm curiosity that seemed entirely disconnected from the ruined ceremonial coat. Emily could hear her own heartbeat echoing inside the vast ballroom as confusion replaced fear. She had prepared herself for anger, dismissal, perhaps even exile from palace service. She had never prepared herself for silence. And somewhere beneath the embroidered silver wolf crest hidden by the spreading crimson stain, a faint warmth began to awaken, unnoticed by everyone except the man wearing it. The warmth beneath Adrian Blackwood's ceremonial crest spread slowly across his chest, subtle enough that no one else could have noticed, yet impossible for him to ignore. It was not painful. It was familiar in a way he could not explain, like hearing the echo of a forgotten melody from childhood. His silver eyes never left Emily Carter, who remained standing before him with lowered shoulders and clasped hands, waiting for whatever judgment the evening would bring. Every lesson she had learned inside the palace told her that silence from a king was rarely comforting. It simply meant the decision had not yet been spoken. Around them, the magnificent ballroom remained suspended in uneasy anticipation. The musicians held their instruments without daring to play another note. Palace guards maintained perfect discipline, though their eyes revealed uncertainty. Distinguished nobles exchanged cautious whispers that never quite became conversations, each wondering why the Alpha King had not responded according to tradition. Lady Victoria Ashcroft folded her hands elegantly before her, carefully hiding her growing confusion behind practiced grace. She had expected swift consequences. Instead, every passing second seemed to pull the evening further beyond her understanding. Adrian finally spoke, his voice calm enough to settle across the silent ballroom without effort. "What is your name?" The question stunned everyone present. Emily blinked once before cautiously lifting her eyes. She had expected to hear an accusation, perhaps an order removing her from royal service, but certainly not a simple question. Her voice trembled despite every attempt to steady it. "Emily Carter, Your Majesty." Adrian repeated the name quietly, almost as though testing how it sounded. Emily Carter. Something about those words seemed to linger in the air longer than they should have. He studied her face with thoughtful curiosity, noticing details that somehow felt significant despite having no reason to be. Her calm blue eyes held honesty rather than fear alone. Her posture remained respectful without becoming desperate. Even standing before the most powerful man in the kingdom, she had chosen responsibility over excuses. He sensed no deception in her apology. More surprisingly, something deep within him refused to believe she belonged among the invisible faces of palace servants. The feeling made no logical sense, yet it refused to disappear. Emily struggled to understand the king's expression. Instead of disappointment, she saw quiet concentration, as though he were searching for an answer hidden beyond ordinary sight. The silence gradually became uncomfortable for everyone except Adrian himself. Finally, one senior noble stepped forward with careful diplomacy. "Your Majesty," he began respectfully, "the banquet schedule is waiting. Perhaps palace staff should escort the servant away while preparations continue." Several guests nodded in quiet agreement. It sounded reasonable. Order could be restored. The celebration could continue. Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the crimson stain across his ceremonial coat before returning his attention to Emily. "Did you intend to harm me?" he asked gently. Emily looked genuinely startled. "No, Your Majesty. Never." "Did you act carelessly?" She lowered her eyes again, remembering every moment leading to the accident. "I believed I was being careful. I do not understand exactly how it happened." Her honest uncertainty carried none of the rehearsed confidence often heard inside royal courts. Adrian believed her. Before he could respond, the high priestess suddenly tilted her head slightly, her ancient eyes narrowing with quiet curiosity. She had sensed something unusual settling across the room, something older than ceremony and deeper than politics. It was faint, almost impossible to identify, like moonlight reflected across distant water. She discreetly observed the king's chest, where the embroidered silver wolf crest rested beneath the spilled wine. For one brief instant, she thought she saw a delicate shimmer beneath the fabric itself. It vanished so quickly she questioned whether her eyes had imagined it. Yet the feeling remained. Adrian unconsciously placed one hand over the stained crest as the mysterious warmth intensified again, no longer resembling simple heat, but a living pulse that echoed with remarkable steadiness. At nearly the same moment, Emily instinctively touched the small crescent pendant hidden beneath the collar of her servant uniform. It, too, felt unexpectedly warm against her skin. She frowned slightly, believing the crowded ballroom or her own nervousness might be responsible. Neither of them understood that two ancient symbols, separated by years of forgotten history, had begun responding to one another beneath the quiet attention of a full moon that shone through the towering palace windows. Moonlight poured through the towering stained glass windows, washing the magnificent ballroom in pale silver as though the night itself had stepped inside the palace to witness what was about to happen. Adrian Blackwood slowly lowered his hand from the embroidered wolf crest on his ceremonial coat, yet the mysterious warmth beneath the fabric continued to pulse with quiet persistence. It no longer felt like an ordinary sensation. It moved with a steady rhythm that seemed strangely alive, responding to something beyond his understanding. Emily Carter remained standing only a few feet away, still believing the silence surrounding her would eventually end with a formal punishment. Instead, she became aware that the small crescent pendant, resting beneath the collar of her servant uniform, had grown noticeably warmer against her skin. She instinctively pressed her fingertips against the hidden necklace, hoping no one would notice the unusual movement. The moment her fingers touched the pendant, a delicate silver light escaped through the fabric for the briefest instant before fading again. The high priestess immediately noticed it. Her calm expression changed almost imperceptibly as she took one slow step forward from the royal platform, her eyes moving between Emily's collar and the king's ceremonial crest. Years of studying forgotten traditions had taught her to recognize signs that others dismissed as coincidence. This was not coincidence. Adrian looked down just as another faint glow spread beneath the crimson wine stain covering the silver wolf crest. The embroidered symbol shimmered softly beneath the damp fabric, its light becoming visible despite the heavy ceremonial cloth. Quiet gasps echoed throughout the ballroom. Several nobles leaned closer, unsure whether they had truly witnessed the strange light or imagined it beneath the reflections of countless candles. The royal historian adjusted his spectacles with visible disbelief, staring directly at the king's chest before slowly shifting his attention toward the young Omega standing nearby. Emily suddenly felt the pendant become almost weightless. Without thinking, she loosened the top button of her modest servant collar just enough to keep herself comfortable. The ancient silver crescent hidden beneath the fabric emerged slightly into view, suspended from its worn chain. Before she could tuck it back beneath her clothing, the pendant answered the glowing crest with its own soft silver radiance. The two lights pulsed together in perfect harmony. The ballroom fell into complete silence once again. No music, no whispers, only hundreds of astonished eyes fixed upon the impossible sight unfolding before them. Lady Victoria Ashcroft's confident smile disappeared for the first time that evening. She stared at the glowing pendant with genuine confusion before quickly recovering her elegant posture. Whatever she had planned, this had never been part of it. Adrian found himself unable to look away from Emily. The mysterious warmth inside his chest had become remarkably calm, replacing uncertainty with an unfamiliar sense of recognition. It was not the recognition of memory. It was something older, quieter, almost instinctive. Emily slowly raised her eyes to meet his once more. Instead of fear, she now felt overwhelming confusion. She had worn the crescent pendant for as long as she could remember. It had belonged to her since childhood, the only possession left with her when she had been found as an infant. Never once had it shown the slightest hint of light. Yet now it shone brightly before the entire royal court. The high priestess stepped closer until she stood between the king and the young servant, carefully studying both ancient symbols without touching either of them. Her voice remained calm, though every word carried unmistakable gravity. No one is to approach them. Palace guards immediately obeyed, quietly preventing curious nobles from moving closer. The elderly priestess continued observing the synchronized glow before speaking again, almost as though she were remembering words that had not been spoken aloud in many years. These are not ordinary ornaments. The royal historian slowly nodded as realization began settling across his face. He searched his memory through countless manuscripts and forgotten records, trying desperately to place the meaning of what stood before him. Adrian finally glanced toward the high priestess. "Have you seen this before?" She remained silent for several long seconds before answering with careful honesty. "Not in my lifetime." Her eyes returned to the shining crescent pendant. "But I have studied descriptions preserved within the oldest royal archives." Every guest inside the ballroom held their breath. Emily unconsciously wrapped her fingers around the glowing pendant while Adrian stood motionless beneath the softly illuminated wolf crest. Neither of them understood why ancient symbols separated by generations had awakened together beneath the light of a single full moon, but everyone present sensed the same undeniable truth. The evening had already become far more than a servant's unfortunate accident. It had become the beginning of a mystery capable of changing the future of the entire kingdom. The silence lingering inside the Grand Moon banquet no longer felt uncertain. It felt sacred. The silver glow slowly faded from the Alpha King's embroidered wolf crest and from the crescent pendant resting in Emily Carter's trembling hand. But the memory of what every witness had just seen remained vivid in every mind. No one returned to casual conversation. No musician dared resume the melody. Even the countless candles flickering throughout the ballroom seemed to burn more quietly beneath the watchful light of the full moon. The high priestess gently folded her hands before her and lifted her eyes toward Adrian Blackwood. "Your Majesty," she said with measured calm. "There are legends that many dismissed as symbolism because no living soul had ever witnessed what has just occurred." Adrian listened without interrupting. His thoughtful expression revealed neither excitement nor fear, only a quiet determination to understand the truth. Emily remained motionless nearby, still trying to comprehend why the small pendant she had carried since childhood had suddenly awakened before the entire kingdom. The high priestess slowly continued. Long before the founding of Blackthorn Palace, the oldest chronicles spoke of an alpha ruler whose wolf would recognize not power, wealth, or noble title, but a soul connected to an ancient promise. The mark was never described as a reward. It was described as a recognition. Gentle whispers spread once again among the gathered nobles. Several exchanged uncertain glances while others appeared deeply uncomfortable. Such stories belonged to forgotten manuscripts rather than royal ceremonies. The royal historian carefully stepped forward, his voice carrying respectful caution. The oldest records also mention a family whose symbol was a silver crescent resting beneath the full moon. Their history vanished generations ago, and many believed both the family and its legacy had been lost forever. Emily instinctively looked down at the pendant resting against her fingertips. Its delicate silver crescent reflected the candlelight with remarkable clarity. She remembered asking about it many years ago while growing up among humble caretakers, but no one had ever known where it came from. They had simply told her that it had been around her neck when she was discovered as a baby wrapped in a faded blanket outside a small village chapel. It had always been the only connection to a past she could never remember. Adrian noticed the uncertainty in her expression. "Who gave you that pendant?" he asked quietly. Emily looked at him before answering with complete honesty. "No one, Your Majesty. I have worn it for as long as I can remember. I was told it was found with me when I was an infant." Her words echoed gently through the silent ballroom. The royal historian slowly closed his eyes for a brief moment, as though assembling fragments of forgotten knowledge scattered across decades of study. "There are very few surviving descriptions," he admitted, "but every illustration I have ever seen of the Lost House Moon Veil includes a crescent exactly like that one." Lady Victoria Ashcroft immediately responded with graceful confidence, determined to restore reason before imagination overtook the royal court. "Ancient stories often resemble one another," she observed politely. "Surely one pendant cannot determine a forgotten bloodline." Her words sounded reasonable, and several nobles nodded in cautious agreement. The high priestess neither argued nor agreed. Instead, she looked directly at Emily with gentle compassion. "No symbol alone can prove identity," she said softly, "but symbols awaken for reasons." Adrian remained silent for several thoughtful moments. He could still feel the faint lingering warmth beneath the wolf crest despite the fading light. Whatever had happened moments earlier refused to leave his thoughts. It was as though an invisible thread had quietly connected two lives that had never crossed before tonight. Emily lowered her eyes once again, overwhelmed by questions she could not answer. She had arrived expecting another ordinary evening, serving distinguished guests. Instead, strangers were discussing forgotten families, ancient promises, and impossible connections that somehow centered upon her. Nothing about it seemed real. The Alpha King finally turned toward the assembled court. His calm voice carried effortlessly across the vast ballroom. "No conclusions will be reached tonight. Every conversation immediately ceased. The truth deserves patience, not speculation. His silver eyes briefly met Emily's before returning to the gathered nobles. Tomorrow, the royal archives will be opened. Every surviving record connected to these symbols will be examined without prejudice. No one challenged his decision. The high priestess bowed respectfully. The royal historian nodded with visible relief. Even Lady Victoria concealed her disappointment behind another flawless smile. Emily gently closed her hand around the crescent pendant once more, unaware that somewhere deep beneath Blackthorn Palace, forgotten records preserved for generations were quietly waiting to reveal a history that neither she nor the Alpha King had ever imagined. The gathering slowly began to breathe again, but nothing inside the Grand Moon banquet felt the same. The musicians remained silent, servants stood motionless beside polished marble columns, and the distinguished guests watched Adrian Blackwood with quiet expectation. The Alpha King allowed his gaze to travel across the enormous ballroom before returning to Emily Carter, who still stood with remarkable composure despite the uncertainty surrounding her. She had become the center of every whispered conversation in the kingdom without seeking attention, and Adrian recognized the weight such attention could place upon someone who had never asked for it. He took one deliberate step forward, his calm voice carrying naturally through the magnificent hall. Until the truth has been fully examined, Emily Carter will remain under the direct protection of the crown. The declaration echoed through the ballroom like the ringing of a great bell. Surprise appeared across countless faces. Several nobles exchanged uneasy glances while palace servants stared openly in disbelief. Never before had an ordinary servant received such protection during a royal investigation. Lady Victoria Ashcroft maintained her graceful posture, although her expression tightened for only an instant before returning to practiced elegance. "Your Majesty," she said respectfully, "forgive my concern, but such an extraordinary decision may encourage unnecessary speculation among the court." Adrian looked toward her without the slightest trace of irritation. "Speculation grows when innocent people are left defenseless," he replied evenly. "Truth grows when they are given the opportunity to be heard." His measured words settled the discussion before it could become an argument. No one questioned him further. Emily looked at the king with visible astonishment. She had prepared herself for dismissal from palace service, perhaps even permanent disgrace. Instead, she had been granted the protection of the highest authority in the kingdom. The unexpected kindness left her almost unable to speak. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "I do not know how to thank you." Adrian offered a small, reassuring smile that carried quiet sincerity rather than royal distance. "You do not owe me gratitude. If tonight has taught us anything, it is that appearances alone rarely tell the complete story." Those words settled gently within Emily's heart. For the first time since the accident, the fear that had surrounded her began to loosen its grip. She still understood nothing about the glowing pendant or the mysterious response from the king's wolf crest, yet she no longer felt completely alone beneath the countless watchful eyes surrounding her. The high priestess stepped forward once more. "The royal archives should be opened at first light," she said. "The oldest records have remained untouched for generations. If answers still exist, they will be found there." The royal historian nodded immediately. "I shall prepare every surviving document connected to House Moonvale and the ancient wolf traditions before sunrise." Adrian agreed with a quiet inclination of his head. "Then tomorrow we seek facts, not assumptions." As the formal gathering slowly began dispersing, Emily instinctively touched the crescent pendant resting against her chest. It had become cool once again, as though the strange light had never existed. Yet she knew what she had witnessed, just as everyone else inside the ballroom had. Across the hall, an elderly palace steward named Thomas Whitmore paused beside one of the marble pillars. His weathered eyes rested upon the silver crescent pendant with unmistakable recognition. He did not speak. He simply watched Emily disappear beside the royal attendants, his expression carrying the quiet sorrow of someone who had guarded an impossible secret for many years. Almost beneath his breath, he whispered, "After all this time, you finally came home." By the time the first light of dawn reached the highest towers of Blackthorn Palace, the celebration had become nothing more than a distant memory, replaced by a quiet sense of expectation that settled over the entire royal court. Long before most nobles had awakened, the ancient doors leading to the royal archives were unlocked for the first time in many years. Layers of dust rested upon towering shelves filled with leather-bound records, hand-drawn family trees, ceremonial journals, and forgotten maps whose edges had faded with time. The air carried the scent of old parchment and polished oak, while narrow beams of morning sunlight filtered through high stone windows, illuminating countless particles drifting silently through the chamber. Adrian Blackwood entered first, followed by the High Priestess, the royal historian, Emily Carter, and two trusted royal attendants. Emily walked quietly behind them, still wearing the same modest servant dress from the previous evening, although her expression had changed. Fear had slowly given way to cautious curiosity. She still struggled to believe that only a few hours earlier she had expected to lose everything. Yet now she stood inside the most protected room in the kingdom beside the Alpha King himself. The royal historian carefully removed several large volumes from an upper shelf before placing them upon an enormous wooden table. One by one, he opened fragile pages covered with elegant handwriting and faded royal seals. Ancient illustrations of forgotten noble families slowly appeared before them. Adrian patiently examined every page while Emily remained respectfully silent, uncertain whether she even belonged inside such an important search. Suddenly, the historian stopped turning pages. His weathered fingers rested upon an illustration painted centuries earlier. At its center appeared a silver crescent pendant identical to the one resting around Emily's neck. He looked up slowly, his voice almost becoming a whisper. "This is the crest of House Moonvale." Emily instinctively reached for her pendant. The similarity was unmistakable. Every delicate curve matched perfectly. According to these records, the historian continued, House Moonvale was known not only for its wisdom, but also for protecting several of the oldest traditions connected to the royal wolf lineage. Their family disappeared from public history many years ago after a tragedy that was never fully explained. Emily lowered her eyes, trying to absorb words that seemed impossible to connect with her own ordinary life. "I do not remember any family," she admitted softly. "I only remember growing up in a small village after kind people found me as a child." Before anyone could respond, a familiar voice quietly echoed from the entrance of the archives. "Because you were never meant to remember." Everyone turned toward the doorway. Thomas Whitmore stood there with calm dignity, leaning lightly upon his polished walking cane. His silver hair framed a face marked by age, kindness, and memories carried for far too many years. Adrian welcomed him with a respectful nod. "Thomas, you wish to speak." The elderly steward slowly approached the table, his eyes never leaving Emily. Emotion softened his expression as he looked at the young woman standing before him. "I have waited many years for this morning," he said gently. Emily stared at him with growing confusion. Thomas smiled sadly before reaching into the inner pocket of his coat. He carefully placed a small carved wooden box upon the table. Time had worn its edges smooth, but an elegant silver crescent remained engraved upon its lid. Emily's breathing slowed as she recognized the symbol immediately. Thomas rested one hand upon the old box before quietly speaking the words that changed everything. "On the night you were found, I was the man who carried you to safety." The room fell completely silent. Emily could only stare at him, her heart racing with questions she had dreamed of asking her entire life. Thomas met her tearful eyes with gentle certainty. "And at last, I can help you discover who you truly are." Emily Carter could not take her eyes off Thomas Whitmore. The elderly steward stood quietly beside the ancient table, his weathered hand resting gently upon the small wooden box engraved with the same silver crescent that hung around her neck. For years she had accepted that the beginning of her life would remain an unanswered question, a mystery carried silently in her heart. Now, standing inside the forgotten royal archives, someone was telling her that the answers had been waiting all along. Thomas slowly opened the carved box. Inside rested a carefully folded piece of pale blue fabric embroidered with an elegant silver crescent surrounded by delicate branches beneath a full moon. Although time had softened its colors, the craftsmanship remained unmistakably noble. Beside it lay a tiny silver bracelet, clearly made for an infant. Emily instinctively reached toward the bracelet but stopped just before touching it, afraid that even the smallest movement might somehow shatter the unbelievable reality unfolding before her. Thomas smiled kindly. "This belonged to you," he said softly. "It was around your wrist the night I carried you away." Emily finally looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did no one tell me?" Thomas lowered his eyes for a moment before answering. "Because those who survived believed secrecy was the only way to protect you. If anyone had discovered who you were, your future would never have been your own." Adrian Blackwood listened without interruption. He could see the mixture of hope, confusion, and quiet sorrow crossing Emily's face as each answer uncovered even greater questions. The high priestess carefully unfolded the blue cloth, revealing a royal seal stitched into one corner. The royal historian immediately recognized it. "There can be little doubt now," he said with respectful certainty. "These are authentic heirlooms of House Moonvale." Emily slowly closed her fingers around the tiny bracelet. It felt strangely familiar despite belonging to memories she could not recall. "Does that mean I truly belong to that family?" she asked. Thomas nodded gently. "Yes, your parents loved you deeply. They wanted you to grow up in a kingdom where kindness mattered more than titles. They never imagined fate would separate you so soon." Tears gathered in Emily's eyes, not from sadness alone, but from finally hearing words she had longed to hear her entire life. She had always believed she came from nowhere. Now she understood that she had come from somewhere remarkable, even if she could not yet remember it herself. Adrian stepped closer, his calm voice carrying quiet reassurance. "Your past explains where you began. It does not decide who you have become." Emily looked toward him, surprised by the sincerity in his words. He continued, "Everything I have witnessed since last night tells me that your kindness was never inherited from a name. It was chosen through every ordinary day you believed no one was watching." Those simple words eased the uncertainty weighing upon her heart. For the first time since entering the palace ballroom the previous evening, she no longer felt defined by the accident that had changed everything. Thomas carefully closed the wooden box before speaking once more. "There is still one final record hidden beneath these archives. Your parents left a message that was never meant to be opened until the rightful moment arrived." The high priestess exchanged a thoughtful glance with Adrian. The royal historian slowly nodded, already understanding what Thomas meant. Somewhere below the oldest foundations of Blackthorn Palace, beyond shelves untouched for generations, another chamber waited in complete silence. And within that forgotten room rested the final piece of a story that had begun long before Emily Carter had ever known her own name. The hidden chamber beneath the royal archives was smaller than anyone had expected, yet every stone seemed to carry the weight of generations. At its center stood a single carved pedestal where an elegant wooden case rested, untouched beneath a layer of fine dust. The silver crescent engraved upon its lid matched the pendant around Emily Carter's neck perfectly. Thomas Whitmore carefully stepped aside, allowing Emily to approach first. "This was always meant to be opened by you," he said softly. Emily's hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside rested a carefully preserved letter sealed with the ancient crest of House Moonvale. The paper had aged with time, but the handwriting remained beautifully clear. The high priestess gently broke the seal and handed the letter to Emily. Her eyes filled with emotion as she quietly began to read. The message was simple. Her parents wrote that if she was reading those words, then destiny had carried her safely beyond the darkness they could not escape. They asked her never to measure her worth by a family name, a royal title, or the opinions of others. Instead, they hoped she would become someone who chose kindness even when the world offered judgment, because true greatness was always revealed through compassion. Emily slowly lowered the letter, tears resting quietly in her eyes. She finally understood that the greatest gift her parents had left behind was not a forgotten bloodline, but the values they had hoped would guide her life. Adrian Blackwood watched her with quiet admiration. The mysterious connection that had awakened between them no longer felt like an accident. It felt like two paths that had been moving toward each other long before either of them had realized it. He stepped beside her and looked toward the morning light beginning to shine through a narrow stone window high above the chamber. "The kingdom will learn the truth," he said calmly. "But it will also learn something even more important. Character cannot be inherited. It is earned." Emily smiled gently, the uncertainty that had followed her for so many years finally beginning to fade. Then I hope they remember me for who I became, not only for where I came from. Adrian nodded with quiet respect. I believe they already have. Together they walked back through the ancient corridors and emerged onto the marble balcony overlooking Blackthorn Palace. The first rays of sunrise stretched across forests, rivers, and distant mountains as the kingdom awakened beneath a sky filled with hope instead of mystery. Emily held the silver crescent pendant in her hand, while Adrian's embroidered wolf crest caught the golden morning light. Neither symbol glowed now because they no longer needed to. Their purpose had never been to create destiny. They had simply revealed it. Side by side, they looked toward the future with calm confidence, knowing that truth, patience, and kindness had accomplished what fear and prejudice never could. Sometimes the smallest moment can change an entire life, and sometimes the greatest destinies begin with what everyone else mistakes for an ordinary accident. If this story reminded you that kindness is never weakness and that every person deserves to be seen for who they truly are, please subscribe to the channel. Give this video a like, share it with someone who believes in hope and second chances, and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from and what moment touched your heart the most. Your support helps bring more stories of courage, compassion, and destiny to life.